So Dr. Lockenstein asks, do you think having more things to do at base would make the game more interesting, while also perhaps giving you an excuse to have a smaller world or map? So that's actually something that Brian Giammi and I, like, years ago talked about, was the fact that, when we were shipping State of Decay 2, one of the kind of late decisions that we made was making it so that rucksacks had to be delivered home at the base. They couldn't be delivered at outposts. Originally, that actually was the plan. We were treating rucksacks like normal inventory items. They actually would have a spot in the supply locker, and the way you would withdraw a rucksack, it wouldn't involve the storage at all. You would just have a place in your supply locker where all of the resources that you had at your base were represented as rucksacks. You could just withdraw them as like normal items, which meant you could also deposit them like normal items just by going to an outpost. But there was this thing that folks on the team were noticing during playtests, which is nobody ever went home. Nobody ever went to their base. And so you would, invest all of this sort of these resources in building up your base, but you would never spend any time there. So it was all just kind of imaginary. You wouldn't get any really strong positive feedback for having built up your base. And so there was this thought that, if we give players a reason to go back to the base, they'll be able to enjoy their progress more. And so, unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of time to think that through much further, and certainly we didn't have time to add any elaborate new features to the game. So the rucksack solution was a solution that kind of worked. You did have to come back to your base. You could look it over, see, these people are living in this place that I built up, and get a little bit of that positive emotional feedback for having made progress. But when we were thinking about ways to improve the game after the fact, Brian and I got into some conversations where we were thinking, what would a better solution to that problem be? Better than just saying you have to go home with rucksacks because we said so. What would a better motivation for going home be? And we came up with this idea that that I think it would take a lot to implement something like this. We were like, what we probably should have done was set it up so that instead of the missions that are spawned by your characters, all of them were just sort of these there's a location out of the environment where there's a thing you need to find for me. They were all structured like that. We're like, well, what if you had a different kind of mission for your people at home, which was, I'm having a problem and or I'm thinking about something, and if you come and talk to me, you can solve problems at the base. You can get new advantages at the base. Basically, having some of your base progress be built not around just earning resources and building stuff, but rather doing things for people and leveling up the people. And so we were thinking what if every character at any given point has got something that they want to do, some problem that they have or some ambition that they have. And if you go home to your base and you go around and you talk to people, you can optionally decide to opt into missions for these people, go out and do them, come back home and then get some benefit for having done something for that person. And not only would that give you more agency over which missions get spawned, because these missions would not appear on your mission list unless you opted into them. So they wouldn't just be nagging you to do a bunch of stuff. Instead, it would be fully optional. But because you had opportunities to get base advantages for going home and interacting directly with your people and talking to them, and that your people themselves could actually get better, or the base could get better, or maybe there are problems, things like characters being frustrated that could be resolved this way. A big part of managing your base would be going home, talking to your people, and finding out their goals, and finding out opportunities for things you could do for prizes. And so we thought that would have been a better solution rather than the rucksack thing. It also would have been extremely expensive to implement. And so it's not the kind of thing we could have done late in development. But that's the kind of thing that we were thinking of. So yeah, Dr. Lackenstein, I agree with you that having more stuff to do at base, things that feel like I can get a real advantage in the game by coming home and doing this thing, it would make the game, I think, more interesting. It would certainly make coming home to the base more interesting. And I don't know if it necessarily would mean that we could get by with a smaller map. I think a lot of it depends on if you're because I think the kind of thing I was describing was specifically designed for what is an augmentation we can make to the current game at its current scale and pacing to make it better. I think if you're talking about being able to get away with having less of a map because the player just literally can have entire adventures at their base without ever needing to leave, that's a different level of that kind of feature. That it's conceivable, but I don't know if we would necessarily want that, just because I think a lot of what you're a lot of what the fantasy is in this game is, like you've got the characters who stay home, who maybe you leave them home all the time because they've got a valuable skill. Like it's your doctor, you don't want to put them at risk. There's people, and in any zombie story, there's usually the people who spend most of their time staying at home, but then the people who are your protagonists are usually the people who are leaving the base, people who are going out and trying to accomplish things at the risk of their lives. And those tend to be the sort of fan favorite characters, people like Daryl Dixon, stuff like that. And so I think that the fantasy of State of Decay is probably more like I'm the person who's out there in the wild, putting myself at risk, and the base is an important investment that I have, but it's not the percentage of time I spend at the base. I'm doing the interesting stuff. I'm building it up, I'm defending it, but I'm not spending all of my time there. I think that we would need to keep the balance on the player being out in the world, out on their own, untethered from their sort of support structure, so that you can get that sense of being of being at risk, which I think is a big part of what the fantasy is. Lockenstein says, I like that the other survivors have side quests, but it would be neat if they happened more RPG style instead of just random mission spawn. Yeah, I think that we're thinking along the same lines. That the fact that, and this is something we realized after the game was released, and there's a couple of places where we've tried to claw this back a little bit, where we relied too much on randomness and not enough on sort of reading the player's actions. And so like a lot of our early plans for the game did involve either reading the player's actions or just reading the player's situation and giving them missions that felt extremely appropriate. But unfortunately, that for various reasons, that didn't quite work, at least at the stage of development where we were doing it. And so we went for more of a random system, but we didn't anticipate the degree to which it would just feel like you didn't have any control over what was going on. And I think that's sort of the thing that becomes frustrating about that. You're like, oh, good, the Prepper Ant mission. You're just like, kind of rolling your eyes a little bit because the game decided you wanted something that you didn't really want. You've seen it a million times before. There's various reasons why that wasn't what you wanted to do today. And it's okay to have a certain amount of randomness, but I think that the randomness should be built around a certain amount of either simulation where the player feels like, oh yeah, this thing that happened is the natural consequence of one of my actions or something that I knew was going on in the world. It didn't just feel like somebody rolled some dice and just gave me a thing. It should feel like it's motivated by something. Preferably something that I could potentially have an impact on. That's a better way to do it. Or just have things be directly the cause, directly a consequence of a player choice. The player decides to pursue a certain thing, and that has consequences, and that drives additional events that happen, that not all of them are within the player's control, but the player can see a connection between what they did and what happened. Those kinds of things can feel a lot more satisfying because players can feel like, oh, this is my playthrough that's motivated by all the stuff that I chose, rather than feeling like I'm just, I'm gambling, basically. So Lockenstein says, I do know that I enjoy the stuff I do at home in Project Zomboid, but I can do without the organization simulator. Yeah, so that is one thing that we try to do in State of Decay 2, is we try to take, if we want each part of the game to either be simple enough or be potentially simple enough that you don't have to invest a bunch of time in it if you don't like it. Like if you don't like organizing your base, we've made it so that everything's in a single supply locker that has infinite capacity, so you don't have to be like managing all the boxes like I do it in Valheim all the time, trying to remember what box I put something in. And Zomboid was the same way. State of Decay 2, we just skipped that whole thing. And even though that problem of solving where to put things can be interesting, and it's kind of fun sometimes to organize your base, in State of Decay 2, we figure a lot of our players, that's not the thing they came to the game for. And so they like having a base, but they don't want the base to be so involved and require so much attention from them that it detracts from everything else. Anyway, I've spent a lot of time answering Lockenstein, so I should probably wrap up this little episode of viewer questions. So there you go. I might have another one that I want to answer, though, so that one's going to go there.